In the long shadows of the Second World War, the campaign fought in Burma remains one of the least remembered. Black and white photographs show weary men in plain uniforms moving across muddy roads, villages in the background caught between subsistence and disruption. The public accounts of the conflict speak of necessity, of defense against expansion across Asia, and of sacrifice that fit within a larger global story. Yet the silences surrounding these accounts are striking. Entire groups who carried supplies, guarded transport routes, or endured the jungle climate are rarely mentioned in official histories. Their names fade into margins, their images into anonymous files. The surviving documents may offer clues. Some carry stamped dates that do not align with later reports. Others have reference numbers that appear to have been changed, suggesting the slow reshaping of memory through the administrative process. In the quiet corners of archives, folded memoranda still bear the marks of decisions that touched thousands of lives, but were never explained in public statements. What emerges is a history that may be accurate in broad outline, but partial in human scale. The campaign's impact on communities, families, and veterans is less visible, though no less real. This program does not claim to provide final answers. Instead, it offers glimpses into the record and suggests ways the story might be read differently. Through portraits, documents, and unspoken absences, we trace how a war shaped not only battlefields, but also memory, policy, and the lived experiences of those forgotten at its edges. Chapter 1. Shadows along the frontier. The Burma frontier in the early 1940s was marked by heat, humidity, and silence, broken only by the steady march of men in plain uniforms along narrow dirt tracks. Archival photographs in black and white capture these figures in long lines, carrying their packs and rifles, with rural hamlets and palm trees behind them. These images are familiar from official histories that describe the campaign as a necessary extension of Allied defense against the Japanese advance into Southeast Asia. Yet when studied closely, the tone of those accounts appears selective. The public record often highlights the involvement of larger, well-equipped units while relegating indigenous regiments and auxiliary workers to the background. This creates an impression of orderly coordination, though surviving evidence suggests otherwise. For example, a folded memorandum from the period shows an official date stamp that does not align with later reports, and a file number that appears to have been altered, raising questions about what was recorded at the time and what was changed later. Such small inconsistencies may not alter the broad outline of events, but they do suggest a quieter reality. Soldiers often operated with limited supplies, relying on local communities for food and shelter, while families nearby endured shortages and restricted movement. Wide shots of markets with half-empty stalls evoke the strain felt by civilians, living at the edge of the front line. Close portraits of young men in worn collars reflect exhaustion that official photographs rarely admit. When the camera shifts to exterior views of bamboo huts under monsoon clouds, the daily rhythms of life appear fragile, disrupted not just by enemy forces, but by the demands of armies claiming space and resources. The official purpose of the WWII campaign was presented as defense of empire and protection of broader strategy, but to many on the ground, it might have seemed like another form of imperial extension. Communities were called upon for labor, transport, and local knowledge, often with little recognition or reward. Their role is not prominent in celebratory speeches or commemorative events, yet their presence is visible in incidental details. A group of porters behind a regiment in a blurred photograph, or annotations in margin notes indicating supplies, drawn from unnamed villages. These fragments suggest contributions that were crucial yet unacknowledged. As soldiers pushed further into jungle terrain, the toll on their health and morale deepened. The plain uniform, once pressed and neat at departure, quickly became frayed and patched, a symbol of endurance rather than prestige. Black and white, images of such figures rarely made it into official albums. Instead, The visual record favored neat formations at parade grounds or strategic briefings inside offices. This contrast between staged images and candid shots indicates how memory was curated even during the war itself. A recurring motif appears in these materials: the file stamp on a corner of a document, the folded paper tucked into a ledger, the uniform lapel visible at the edge of a photograph. Each suggests the hand of bureaucracy shaping how the campaign would later be remembered. For those living at the frontier, however, survival was immediate and material. Grain was scarce, travel was restricted, and entire villages adjusted to the presence of marching columns. Yet when official reports summarized the situation, they often emphasized progress and discipline, leaving little room for the hardships endured. This raises questions about whose voices were preserved and whose were set aside. By lingering on these understated details, we begin to see how the lived experience at the frontier diverged from the polished account. The silence in the record may be as telling as the entries themselves. What was omitted and why remains uncertain. As the archival photographs fade into view, the viewer is invited to imagine the ordinary lives that unfolded alongside the official campaign. These shadows along the frontier prepare us for the next layer of the story, where the war was filtered through dusty corridors of administration and the decisions made at desks far from the battlefield. Chapter 2: Records. In dusty corridors of memory, inside administrative corridors, rows of stacked file folders created a hush in the air. Clerks moved with slow, deliberate steps between wooden shelves and metal cabinets. Each movement left a whisper of paper and the faint smell of ink. The black and white images show mid-shots of hands turning brittle pages. In one frame, a folded memorandum sits at an angle on an oak desk. A recurring file stamp appears on the corner of many documents. Office interiors seem orderly, but the paperwork tells a more complex story. Reports prepared at small desks might reflect priorities far removed from frontline realities. The public narrative emphasized supply chains and coherent planning across the region. Yet private papers sometimes indicate improvisation and pragmatic adaptation in the field. Margin notes can reveal decisions made hastily under pressure or through negotiation. Such annotations may contradict the polished summaries filed later as official record. A clerk's pencil mark, faint but persistent, can alter the tone of an entire report. The presence of a changed reference number in a ledger suggests administrative reshuffling. These shifts might reflect clerical error, but they could also point toward purposeful reclassification. Boxes of correspondence often show overlapping dates, making the timeline difficult to reconcile. A stamped date on a dispatch that contradicts later testimony raises questions about sequence. These inconsistencies do not automatically overturn existing histories. They do, however, encourage careful reading and sober skepticism. For many who worked within these corridors, the job was routine and deeply human. They sorted requisitions, logged transit orders, and updated pay ledgers. They dealt with travel manifests that guided trains and riverboats far from the administrative center. A photograph captures a mid-shot of a travel manifest beside a tin case. The manifest bears a fold and the crisp impression of a file stamp. In other images, uniform lapels peek into the frame, suggesting a link between policy and person. The recurring motif of folded memoranda connects offices to camps and to supply depots. Often, decisions recorded on paper had immediate human consequences. In villages and on transport platforms, a delayed requisition meant hunger for a family reliant on a rationed allotment. A misfiled pension form could deny pensions to widows and dependents. Many ledgers show entries that later lack corresponding signatures. This absence seems procedural, but it might also indicate hurried approvals or delegated authority. The administrative language often emphasized efficiency and economy. It might also have obscured harder choices about who would receive scarce resources. A mid-shot of a pension ledger reveals marginalia that complicate the official tally. Handwritten. Notes beside printed sums suggest that adjustments were common. Adjustments could be minor, or they could reshape an individual's access to benefits. The viewers see close portraits of clerks bent over desks, their sleeves rolled, exchanging folded directives. Their plain coats and practical shoes reflect a workforce focused on stewardship rather than ceremony. Yet, the tone of the correspondence seems to privilege strategic objectives. Local demands rarely appear in the opening pages of summarized reports. Instead, local voices survive in attachments, in letters tucked into envelopes and folded into files. These attachments sometimes contain testimonies from village leaders and local intermediaries. Their handwriting is often small, squeezed into margins between typed lines. In one image, a small letter is visible under a larger report. The letter's stamp appears to predate the report it references. This kind of mismatch can suggest delayed filing or retroactive insertion. Either possibility signals a fluid record rather than a static archive. For families seeking recognition, such fluidity carried weighty consequences. A missing endorsement could delay a pension for months. A misread reference number could redirect supplies to another district. The administrative corridors were not neutral backdrops. They shaped the way wartime experience was recorded and later remembered. Photographs of clerks and file rooms emphasize the human labor behind archives. They also point to the institutional habit of curating memory through classification. When records were reorganized, certain narratives became more visible. Others receded into drawers and unlabeled boxes. The motif of the file stamp recurs in these reordered materials. It appears as a small, decisive mark on otherwise ordinary pages. A stamped date can authenticate a document or obscure a nuance. In some instances, stamped dates seem to conflict with oral accounts collected later. These anomalies invite historians to cross-check multiple sources. They also suggest that memory was shaped as much by paperwork as by events. The archive thus becomes an active participant in constructing history. Within these corridors, petitions from veterans and families waited in trays. Many petitions carried personal details about service and loss. The forms, typed and folded, sometimes show corrections in a different ink. Such corrections could indicate subsequent review or a change in policy. Boxes labeled with faded ink contain correspondence between distant offices. The exchange often concerned logistics, troop movement, and civilian provisioning. Yet the same correspondence might also discuss contract labor hired from local communities. These contracts rarely appear in public narratives. They nonetheless influence the daily lives of villagers who provided portage and lodging. The bureaucratic language of contracting obscured the human labor that kept transport routes open. Amid typed memoranda, there are scribbled notes indicating unpaid claims. These notes sometimes reference numbers that were later altered in central ledgers. The altered numbers can complicate efforts to trace compensation. They can also raise questions about the transparency of allocation. The repeated sight of uniform lapels in marginal photographs connects formal policy to embodied service. Men and women wearing plain uniforms show up in moccasin-scuffed portraits beside paperwork. Their presence in the images remains modest, but persistent. This quiet visibility suggests that records did more than record. They mediated recognition and entitlement. For communities, a file could represent hope or a bureaucratic obstacle. A single stamped endorsement might unlock a pension or a parcel of supplies. Conversely, a missing stamp could mean months of uncertainty. The archive thus affected the rhythm of recovery after conflict. In the dusty corridors, small practicalities mattered greatly. The placement of a folded memorandum on top of an envelope might determine which claim received attention first. Filing clerks exercised routine discretion in ordering trays and processing applications. That discretion shaped the lived distribution of scarcity and support. Over time, routine practices hardened into policy norms. These norms then fed into public accounts that emphasized orderly management and bureaucratic competence. Yet the underlying record shows many instances of improvisation and local negotiation. The documentary images of ledgers, manifestos, and folded notices encourage a closer view. In that view, the official story becomes one of several plausible readings. The archive suggests alternative emphases, such as unequal recognition or the marginalization of auxiliary contributors. At the same time, it indicates the immense scale of administrative effort required to manage a distant campaign. Thousands of documents pass through these corridors each month. Their cumulative effect shaped how people remembered the past. The motif of the file stamp, the folded memorandum, and the uniform lapel ties the personal to the procedural. It also points toward the ways memory was curated, sometimes intentionally, sometimes through routine practice. These corridors thus form a central chapter in understanding the Burma campaign's legacy. As files were closed and cabinets locked, some voices receded into the stacks. Others persisted in the margins, waiting to be rediscovered. The next chapters trace how these bureaucratic choices echoed into transport hubs, homecomings, and public commemoration. Chapter 3. The Silence of Return. Journeys on regional platforms and in dimly lit stations, men and women waited with packs and quiet faces. The photographs show mid-shots of crowds under iron roofs, then close portraits of individuals holding travel passes. Trains moved along muddy tracks between camps and provincial towns, carrying those who had served and those who had supported them. Official dispatches framed these movements as orderly repatriation and routine redeployment. Yet first-hand impressions from the period often feel less tidy and more fraught. Many departures appear improvised. Schedules might have shifted at short notice, leaving families uncertain about return dates. In some cases, travel passes show altered ink where entries were amended hurriedly. A stamped date on a transfer manifest sometimes conflicts with later testimony. These small anomalies do not prove intention. They do, however, suggest that records and reality did not always align. The visual record alternates between wide exterior shots of platforms and intimate close-ups of worn collars and folded memorandum tucked into satchels. Uniform lapels peek into frames beside civilian coats and children's plain garments. That juxtaposition speaks to mixed crowds and overlapping roles. Porters and contract workers moved alongside soldiers. Local guides, once central to daily logistics, often traveled without formal acknowledgement. Their faces appear in background portraits and in marginal notes on lists. Municipal records at times note their involvement only indirectly. Repatriation lists prioritize unit designations, leaving auxiliary contributors in unnamed columns. The result is a public memory that highlights regimental return while sidelining those whose service was irregular. Families waiting at small stations describe both relief and disorientation. A wide shot of a platform shows joyful embraces beside tense, silent figures. Some arrivals were celebrated with processions and official recognition. Others slipped into town unnoticed, their arrival recorded as a routine transit entry in a ledger. The ledger may carry a visible file stamp, a small emblem that implies formal processing. That same stamp may also appear on a folded memorandum authorizing supplies, linking administrative action to movement. Yet not all such paperwork followed those who traveled. In some archives, travel manifests lack corresponding receipts for issued rations. In others, reference numbers in transit logs were changed as boxes were consolidated. Such changes complicate efforts to trace the precise sequence of movements. For individuals, the consequences were tangible. A delayed transfer of pay meant months without expected funds. A misfiled pass could result in detention at a way station. In several documented instances, families reported receiving contradictory notices about homecoming dates. These conflicts appear in letters folded into personal files. Their handwriting is often small and hurried, squeezed between typed paragraphs. These marginal notes provide a human dimension to otherwise sterile lists. They show how simple clerical choices had real effects on lives. The cultural rituals surrounding return varied widely across regions. In some towns, returning men received small ceremonies at town halls. In others, there was only a shared meal and quick dispersal back to farms. The monochrome footage captures both types of scenes. A mid-shot of a modest hall shows plain uniforms, lined up for an announcement. A close-up of a kitchen table shows a family preparing rice for an unexpectedly large number of guests. These domestic images highlight how communities absorbed returns into everyday routines. Yet social reintegration was rarely seamless. Some veterans found employers reluctant to reinstate former positions. Others met changed family dynamics after prolonged absence. The burden on informal caregivers, often women in plain civilian coats, grew when breadwinners returned altered by exhaustion or illness. Public communications framed such adjustments as brief and necessary. Local testimony suggests a more prolonged period of readjustment. Many men and women who returned carried with them unspoken memories of service and loss. They often avoided public mention of hardship. That silence may have been cultural. It may also have been practical, shaped by limited benefits and uncertain recognition. Pension applications illustrate this tension. Some files show marginal annotations indicating incomplete documentation. Other records include notes suggesting additional verification was required. A single missing endorsement could postpone relief. In some instances, requests for clarification led to repeated submissions of the same papers. Each resubmission left a mark, an added fold, an extra pencil note on an otherwise neat page. The recurring motif of the folded memorandum recurs in images of correspondence between district offices and central archives. Those memoranda trace roots of authority and reveal how bureaucratic delays extended the period of uncertainty for returnees. The materiality of paperwork thus anchors human experience. Travel narratives also highlight the role of transit itself as a shaping force. Train platforms, river landings, and convoy routes became sites of chance encounters and fragile networks. People exchanged news, food, and labor on the move. Some used transit hubs to seek out distant relatives. Others leveraged journeys to negotiate passage to new employment. Yet transport infrastructure was often overloaded. Carriages intended for soldiers were sometimes filled with supplies instead. That practical shortage forced creative solutions. Local contractors were hired on short notice. Temporary accommodations sprouted near stations. These improvised systems show adaptability, but also reveal inequality in access. Those with formal documentation navigated the system more easily. Those without proper papers often crossed boundaries with greater risk. Their stories appear faintly in background portraits and in marginal correspondence. Ethnic and linguistic differences complicated reintegration. Returnees who spoke minority languages sometimes found less access to official assistance. Notices issued in the dominant administrative language might not have reached all communities. Local intermediaries often bridge these gaps. Their names are sometimes visible in invoices and small letters folded into files. Such names rarely appear in public accounts. The archival images therefore emphasize the layered human geography of return. The visual sequence moves from crowded platforms to quiet kitchens, from travel manifests to bedside conversations. Across these images, a recurring sense of partial documentation emerges. The official ledger may state a return date. Oral recollections might emphasize months of delay. Cross-checking these sources reveals patterns of mismatch. Those mismatches are neither random nor trivial. They suggest that the process of reintegration was mediated by paperwork, by local negotiation, and by uneven distribution of support. Over time, the cumulative effect of delayed pensions, misfiled passes, and altered reference numbers shaped community memory. Collective narratives developed around those absences and returns. Some communities commemorated the modest moments of homecoming with small plaques and communal meals. Others preserved memory through private albums and folded photographs kept in drawers. The images of train platforms and folded memoranda serve as touchstones for these practices. They remind us that return is never simply a movement from A to B. It is a process that reshapes families, economies, and local governance. The silence surrounding many of these journeys should not be mistaken for absence. It may instead indicate margins of record-keeping, selective recognition, and the everyday choices people made to survive. As these individual returns connect to broader institutional processes, the story opens onto questions about social recovery, recognition, and the long shadow of administrative practice. The next chapter examines how those social consequences settled into communities and how public memory did or did not acknowledge them. Chapter 4. Communities. Left in the shadows, in quiet market towns after the fighting, daily routines adjusted around absence and scarcity. Wide archival photographs show empty stalls and covered baskets on wooden tables. Close portraits capture women in plain civilian coats counting coins at kitchen tables. The scene often appears to be temporary disruption in official accounts, framed as wartime necessity and brief hardship. Yet local testimony suggests disruption was deeper and more enduring than official summaries imply. The film of village life moves between exterior shots of dirt roads and interior scenes of half-used tools. A folded memorandum sometimes appears, tucked into family papers, its edges softened by repeated reading. The recurring file stamp shows institutional attention filtered through distance and delay. Economies shifted as able-bodied people left for service or for contracted labor away from village fields. Many families relied on remittances that arrived sporadically, if at all. Men returned in plain uniforms, their collars worn, bringing back debts and altered expectations. Women who had kept households running often found fewer resources and more responsibilities. Children left school or attended irregularly as teachers moved or supplies faltered. Schoolrooms appear in mid-shots with empty desks and chalkboards, bearing half-erased lessons. The official narrative tends to describe these shifts as necessary wartime adjustments and temporary shortages. Alternative readings suggest uneven support and selective recognition of contributions. In some districts, census tables compiled during and after the war show inconsistent enumeration. Those table inconsistencies complicate efforts to track population loss and labor changes. Local committees sometimes petitioned for relief funds, their requests folded into trays awaiting review. Side ledgers include unacknowledged pension notes tucked into margins and sealed envelopes. Such unacknowledged notes signal administrative oversight or delayed validation. For those left behind, this bureaucratic ambiguity mattered practically. Pension delays could lengthen months into years. Missing entries in local records meant fewer public resources for reconstruction. Reconstruction projects sometimes prioritized infrastructure over household relief. Roads and bridges received attention, while village wells and school repairs waited. Public ceremonies focused on strategic victories rather than on daily recovery. Memorials were erected in central towns, but small communities often received no plaque or formal mention. Family scrapbooks and tucked photographs became private monuments instead. In many homes, a recurring visual motif survived, a photograph with a uniform lapel visible at the edge. That lapel marked service, but not necessarily recognition. The absence of formal markers shaped how communities remembered contribution and loss. Social rituals adapted around scarcity and uncertainty. Communal meals became routine coping mechanisms in some places. Informal savings groups formed to buffer against delayed payments. Extended kin networks absorbed returning members who could not reintegrate into former occupations. Some men sought work in towns or on new transport lines, leaving agricultural plots to others. Migration patterns shifted as families pursued stability. Younger people sometimes moved further afield, seeking opportunities in emerging urban centers. The demographic shifts affected social structures, marriage patterns, and labor availability. Local governance changed too. Village leaders negotiated with distant offices for supplies and recognition. Their letters, folded and filed, often show a repeated plea for clarity on pensions and land allocations. The paperwork reveals negotiation rather than straightforward compliance. Some requests were acknowledged with a file stamp, then delayed for months. Others were redirected without explanation. These differences suggest an uneven application of policy across regions. Mid-shots of council rooms show plain coats around modest tables. Officials appear to balance competing demands with limited means, yet the administrative choices they made produced real winners and losers. Contract labor arrangements sometimes prioritized contractors with connections to central offices. Local providers often received lower pay or irregular compensation. This economic reordering created long-term inequalities within communities. Cultural life adapted. Religious festivals continued, but with smaller processions and quieter music. Memorial traditions shifted from public spectacle to private remembrance. The places where people once gathered for communal labor now hold fewer hands. Oral histories collected years later often include references to unnamed helpers and unregistered porters. Those helpers are rarely visible in public records. Their contributions appear instead in marginal notes and in the texture of family memory. The recurring folded memorandum appears again in these private collections, a small object linking personal testimony to administrative archives. In some villages, women formed associations to press for pensions and support. Meeting minutes survive, in clippings kept in drawers. These clippings document persistent advocacy that might have been too modest for central archives. The interplay between national policy and local action thus becomes evident in small fragments. Health and welfare also shifted. Clinics staffed intermittently treated more chronic conditions after the war. Long-term shortages of medical supplies meant reliance on local remedies and traditional healers. The official records tend to focus on acute wartime injuries rather than on protracted community health needs. Alternative readings suggest public health was a longer-term challenge than commonly acknowledged. The material culture of remembrance changed too. Where official plaques did not exist, families preserved medals and letters in locked boxes. Photographs were often the primary public record of service in a household. Those photographs frequently show uniform lapels in peripheral frames rather than centered portraits. This peripheral visibility mirrors the peripheral status of many contributors in policy terms. Economic measures, like small compensation grants, helped some families. Many others required sustained support that was never fully realized. Unclear. Reference numbers in allocation ledgers sometimes rerouted intended benefits. These altered numbers complicate historical accounting and raise questions about fairness in distribution. The social consequences of omission accumulated over the decades. Educational gaps translated into longer-term reductions in local literacy and vocational skills. Housing repairs delayed by administrative backlog led to deteriorating living conditions. Cultural continuity was strained as elders who remembered service passed without formal recognition. The psychological effects were subtle and enduring. Communities developed narratives of quiet endurance and unspoken sacrifice. These narratives fit social norms in many places, but also masked unmet needs. Public memory favored more visible theaters of war. Local experiences faded from national storytelling, yet the texture of everyday life preserves other truths. The repeated sight of a file stamp on a household petition, the crease of a folded memorandum in a family album, the faint impression of a uniform lapel in a corner of a photograph. These details register the interplay of policy and person. They suggest that omission was not merely administrative error. It might also have been a byproduct of prioritization under pressure. As attention moved to reconstruction and geopolitics, some communities remained in the shadows. Understanding. This shadow requires attention to those subtle archival traces and to oral testimony passed through generations. The story of communities left in the shadows thus moves us toward larger questions about memory and recognition. How are some experiences preserved while others fade? Which bureaucratic choices determine who receives a plaque and who receives a pension? The answers remain partial and contested, guiding us forward to examine how collective memory has been shaped and how the archival record may yet be revised. Chapter 5: Memory Shaped. By Omission Decades. After the conflict, the archival trail returns again and again to small personal items. A folded memorandum appears in many family collections, its crease worn by repeated reading. A photograph with a visible uniform lapel sits in more than one drawer. These objects move between private memory and public record, carrying the weight of absence and unanswered questions. Official narratives of the campaign often place it inside larger strategic frames. Alternative readings emphasize the local and human consequences that official accounts may understate. The contrast between those frames appears across public, histories, and private archives. In some official volumes, the campaign receives brief mention, then moves on to other theaters. In personal albums, entire lifetimes appear in a single image. The discrepancy may reflect editorial choices as much as historical oversight. File stamps on service records sometimes authenticate claims. At other times, stamps seem inconsistent across related files. A surviving ledger may show changed reference numbers, complicating later verification. Such alterations could be clerical, or they might indicate retroactive reclassification. Inconsistent stamped dates appear in several linked documents. These mismatches do not prove malfeasance. They do suggest that the record is mutable and assembled over time. The process of archiving combines urgency with habit. Documents were sorted at speed and under pressure. Over time, orders of folders were adjusted and boxes were relabeled. Those routine acts of curation helped form collective memory. The consequence is that some lives and contributions became visible. Others drifted to the margins. Public commemoration favored certain narratives. Victories and strategic turns received monuments, ceremony, and prose in official histories. Everyday service, local supply networks, and auxiliary labor often did not. This selective visibility shaped community remembrance and entitlement. Where a pension file carries a clear stamp, a family might find support. Where a ledger entry bears an altered reference number, a claim might be delayed. The material consequence of archival choice thus became social consequence. Across generations, these administrative outcomes affected livelihoods. Children of WWII. Veterans sometimes grew up without promised aid. Small repairs to houses remained undone because funds were misallocated or redirected. Community memorials reflect similar patterns. A central town might erect a plaque naming regiments and senior officers. Smaller hamlets often lacked resources to mark local contributors. Private albums thus became de facto memorials for many families. The recurrence of folded memoranda in such albums signals attempts to preserve recognition locally. Memory work occurred in kitchens, at village meetings, and at train platforms where returnees once arrived. The train platform is a repeated visual motif in private recollection. Platforms served as sites of reunion and of quiet dispersal. The platform image returns in oral testimony as both scene and symbol. That dual role matters for how memory is transmitted. Oral histories preserve details absent from formal files. A neighbor's account can correct or complicate an official ledger entry. Still, oral testimony faces challenges of its own. Memories fade, schedules blur, yet patterns persist. Across independent testimonies, when multiple accounts align, they indicate recurrent experience. At that point, the archive and the oral record may converge. Researchers cross-check the folded memorandum against local testimony and manifest entries. Sometimes the result confirms family memory. Other times, it reveals disjunctions that demand closer attention. These disjunctions invite inquiry rather than immediate resolution. The hedged tone of inquiry suits both archival work and community sensitivity. Memory shaped by omission does not always imply conspiracy. It often reflects priorities in a time of limited resources. Administrative systems prioritized efficiency, logistics, and central objectives. Local needs competed with strategic plans for scarce attention. Within that competition, some claims achieved visibility, others did not. The practice of classification favored some categories over others. Certain forms and phrases carried weight in allocation processes. Forms filled. In an approved way received faster processing. Forms that arrived late or with different reference numbers often incurred delay. Such procedural realities changed lives. Delayed pensions meant delayed marriage plans and postponed apprenticeships. Misallocated supplies altered farming cycles. And nutrition. The cumulative effect of many small delays shaped post-war recovery. Over time, this pattern fed into narratives about who was remembered and how. Institutional memory hardened through repetition. Annual reports and commemorative volumes reproduced earlier emphases. Those emphases influenced curricula, public plaques, and regional celebrations. Generations learned a particular public story. Meanwhile, another set of memories persisted privately. Those memories surfaced in classroom anecdotes, in village rituals, and in family albums. Efforts to reconcile these memories with official histories often face bureaucratic hurdles. Requests for file review require forms, stamps, and signatures. The same archival practices that obscured some contributions continue in other instances to gatekeep access. Where a file stamp is clear and a reference number consistent, access is easier. Where anomalies exist, researchers must navigate layers of cross-referencing and corroboration. That labor is painstaking and often relies on local intermediaries. These intermediaries bridge languages, administrative styles, and institutional memory. Their involvement matters to outcomes. When local leaders attach a letter to a petition, the petition sometimes gains traction. When a folded memorandum surfaces with multiple endorsements, it can shift institutional attention. Such procedural details highlight how memory is not only made, but negotiated. They also reveal the mundane levers of recognition. Small acts of stamping, filing, and endorsing accumulate into large social effects. The practical politics of memory, therefore, deserves scrutiny as much as battlefield narratives. Commemoration itself has costs and choices. Funding, location, and inscription reflect institutional priorities. Decisions about what to inscribe determine whose names endure publicly. The absence of names on local monuments suggests an economy of remembrance. Private memorials, in turn, offer different metrics of value. A family's locked box may contain letters, a folded memorandum, and a photograph with a uniform lapel. Those objects measure sacrifice differently than civic plaques do. They shape intergenerational identity and local tradition. Modern efforts to recover forgotten contributors must contend with both archived files and private memory. Collaborative. Projects between institutions and communities can surface overlooked records. Yet such work requires time, trust, and resources. It may also encounter bureaucratic resistance. The persistence of changed reference numbers and inconsistent stamped dates complicates verification. Addressing these complications needs careful methodology and respectful dialogue. When researchers present findings, they must balance evidence with humility. Nuanced explanations reduce the risk of overstated conclusions. They also allow space for community testimony to carry weight. Memory shaped by omission therefore asks for both archival rigor and empathetic listening. The task remains open and ongoing. New inquiries may realign how the campaign is publicly remembered. They may also affect pensions, commemorations, and local education. Such outcomes are possible, but not guaranteed. The story thus ends, for now, with questions that invite further investigation and reflection. Decades of folded memoranda, faded photographs, and file stamps shape the archive's texture. Private boxes and municipal ledgers sit side by side in quiet rooms. Some records carry clear dates and consistent reference numbers, lending immediate weight. Other items show altered ink, changed indices, and marginal annotations that complicate narratives. Written memories in envelopes often reach beyond official volumes and dry reports. Train platforms, market scenes, and council rooms recur as visual anchors across collections. Families preserved uniform lapels and drawers, sustaining recognition, where public markers did not. This layered archive suggests memory was made through choices, omissions, and routine practice. Such patterns may explain why some contributions appear central and others peripheral. Researchers cross-check files, oral testimonies, and ephemera to build cautious reconstructions. Inconsistent stamped dates and shifted reference numbers sometimes require deeper corroboration. Those anomalies do not necessarily indicate malintent, but they demand careful explanation. Community-led projects might surface overlooked records and reframe local commemoration practices. Collaboration between archivists and families can shift how pensions and plaques are pursued. Yet such recovery requires time, trust, resources, and patient methodological care. The files do not speak for themselves. Interpretation matters at every turn. We end with open questions about recognition, justice, and how history is curated. Future inquiry may change commemorative decisions and reshape local education and public memory. Honest reconstruction balances documentary evidence with lived testimony and humility. The archive remains a contested terrain where small marks carry outsized consequences. As investigators revisit ledgers, the story may grow more complex and humane.